The sky above the Dakota Territory told the truth before anything else did. Eleanor Marsh had learned that, in the 2 years since she had buried her husband in the frozen ground of this unforgiving land, she had learned to read the prairie the way some people read scripture carefully with full attention, knowing that a misread passage could cost you everything. And on this November morning in 1882, the sky to the northwest had turned that particular shade of greenish gray that the old-timers called widowmaker light. Not the soft gray of ordinary winter clouds. Something older than that. Something with intent. She stood at the edge of her farmyard, one gloved hand resting on the fence post, and she looked at that sky for a long moment. The wind had gone quiet in the way wind only goes quiet on the Dakota prairie when something enormous is gathering itself just beyond the horizon. The cattle in the far pasture had bunched together without being driven. The horses in the paddock were restless, moving in tight circles, their breath coming in quick white puffs against the cold. Eleanor Marsh was 34 years old. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with the kind of leanness that comes not from lack of food, but from 2 years of working 160 acres with her own 2 hands. Her face carried the particular weathering of a woman who had spent more time outdoors than in fine lines, gathering at the corners of eyes that were the color of winter river water, gray with flecks of brown, always moving, always assessing. She was not a woman who looked fragile. She was not a woman who looked anything other than exactly what she was. Someone who had decided in the face of considerable evidence to the contrary that she intended to survive. She looked at the sky for exactly as long as she needed to look at it. Then she turned and walked toward the barn. Not quickly, not with panic, with the measured pace of someone who has already done everything that panic would suggest weeks and months before this moment ever arrived. That walk, those 30 yards from fence post to barn door, contained the whole of her story. She had come to the Dakota Territory with her husband Niels in the spring of 1878. They had traveled from Minnesota in a wagon that carried everything they owned, which was not much, but which included between them a combined stubbornness that more than compensated for the lack of material wealth. Niels Marsh had been a carpenter by training and a dreamer by nature, a tall, blonde-haired man from a Norwegian family that had spent 3 generations trying to convince various pieces of hostile earth to feed them. He believed with a conviction that was almost religious that the land beneath a man's feet contained everything he would ever need, if only he was patient and observant enough to find it. Eleanor had believed in Niels. That was perhaps the most accurate thing you could say about the early years of their marriage. She had believed in his vision in his hands, in his particular way of standing at the edge of a field and seeing not what was there, but what could be. They had proved up their homestead claim together, breaking sod, building a 2-room house from cottonwood logs, digging a well that hit water on the 3rd attempt after the first 2 came up dry. They had survived the winter of 1878 on sheer determination and a root cellar full of provisions that Niels had insisted on filling before the first frost, despite neighbors who thought he was being excessive. They had been happy in the uncomplicated way that people are happy when they are too busy and too tired for anything else. Then the spring of 1880 came with its mud and its flooding and traveling quietly in the water, the typhoid. Niels was gone in 11 days. There had not been time to properly understand what was happening before it was over. The nearest doctor was 73 miles away, and by the time Eleanor had ridden for help and ridden back, the thing was decided. She had sat beside him on the last night holding his hand, listening to his breathing change. Outside, the Dakota prairie was doing what it always did, insisting on itself indifferent to the human drama playing out inside those thin log walls. His last coherent words to her, spoken 2 days before the end. "This land can shelter us if we let it, Ellie. We just have to listen to what it's trying to say." She had nodded and told him to rest. She had not understood then what he meant. She would spend the next 14 months figuring it out. The winter of 1880 arrived 3 weeks after she buried Niels on the low-rise at the northeast corner of her property and ground she had to chip through with a pickaxe because the frost had already gone deep. She was alone on 160 acres with a mortgage at the land office, 3 milk cows, 2 draft horses, and a determination that she could not yet fully articulate even to herself. What she had more than anything was an engineer's mind that nobody had ever given a proper name to. She had always been this way, taking things apart in her head to see how they worked, reading patterns and systems that other people experienced as random, making calculations in quiet moments that she never wrote down because she had never needed to. In school back in Minnesota, the teacher had called her quick. Her mother had called her peculiar. Niels had called her the smartest person he had ever met, and he had meant it as both a compliment and a practical observation, because her particular kind of intelligence had saved them from significant mistakes more than once in those early homesteading years. Now that mind had nothing to work on but survival. And survival, it turned out, was a problem with a great many interesting variables. The winter of 1880 began her real education. In December of that year, a storm rolled in from the northwest, without the usual warning signs arriving faster than Eleanor had anticipated. She was caught in the barn when it had gone out to feed the livestock at dusk, and found herself suddenly unable to see the house 20 feet away. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 4 hours. The wind came in sideways, driving ice crystals with enough force to cut exposed skin. She stayed in the barn. She had no choice. She spent that night and the following 3 days huddled in the main space of the barn, with her animals burning through her emergency supply of split wood, eating from the tin of hardtack she kept on the shelf by the door, out of a habit she had developed without fully knowing why. The animals generated heat. The packed straw provided some insulation. But the cold still found its way through the log walls, and by the second night the temperature inside the barn had dropped to 12 degrees, and Eleanor was shivering hard enough that rational thought required conscious effort. She survived, obviously. She would not be our story if she had not. But it was during those 3 days that she noticed something which changed everything. The floor of the barn was packed earth-bare soil that had been compacted by years of livestock traffic and her own daily presence. On the second night, unable to sleep, Eleanor had pressed her palm flat against that floor and held it there for a long moment. What she felt was not the biting cold of the air above. What she felt was something that could only be described as mild. Not warm exactly, but not dead with cold the way the walls were, the way the air was, the way everything above a certain height seemed to be. She pressed both hands flat. She held them there until the feeling in them came back. Then she found a stick and scraped away the top layer of packed earth and pressed her palm against the layer beneath it. Warmer still. She did not sleep for the rest of that night. She lay on her side on the barn floor with her cheek against the earth, thinking while the storm raged outside and the cattle shifted in their stalls, and the temperature in the air 3 feet above her head hovered somewhere around 8 degrees. The earth beneath her was holding at something she estimated to be around 45 degrees, maybe higher. In 3 days of forced stillness and forced observation, with nothing else to do and everything at stake, Eleanor Marsh had stumbled onto the fundamental physics of a phenomenon that Norwegian farmers and Mandan earth lodge builders and Icelandic turf house craftsmen had understood for centuries, that the ground itself is a thermal battery absorbing heat in the warm months and releasing it slowly through the cold ones, maintaining a relatively constant temperature at depth, regardless of what the air above it is doing. She had discovered it entirely on her own by pressing her palm against a barn floor in the middle of a blizzard. When the storm broke on the 4th day and she dug herself out into a world transformed by 17 feet of new snow, she stood in the crystalline light and let the realization settle into her. The land can shelter us if we let it. And then she went inside and made herself breakfast because she had livestock to feed and a mortgage to service, and there was no sense being dramatic about it. She did not begin building immediately. That was not her way. Eleanor Marsh spent the remainder of 1880 and all of 1881 spring and summer in a sustained process of education that she pursued with the same systematic patience she brought to every other problem. She read everything she could lay hands on: agricultural journals that arrived months late at the Territorial Library in Yankton, accounts of Scandinavian building practices in the immigrant newspapers, technical descriptions of sod construction in the government's homesteading guides. She studied how her neighbors built. She studied how they failed. She asked careful questions that seemed to be about one thing while actually being about another, gathering information without revealing the direction of her thinking. And she observed the earth. Every week through that spring and summer, she dug test holes in different locations around her property, measuring temperature at different depths at different times of day. She kept the results in a small notebook with a marbled cover that she kept in the bottom of her flour barrel. The numbers were consistent across locations and consistent across time. Below 4 feet, the temperature of the Dakota earth remained between 52 and 56 degrees, regardless of season. It did not matter if the air above was 98 degrees in August or 40 below in January. The earth below the frost line maintained its own reality. In June of 1881, she began to draw plans. Not rough sketches, detailed plans with measurements and load calculations and ventilation diagrams that would not have looked out of place on the desk of a trained engineer. She calculated the volume of air in the proposed chamber and the rate at which a small cast iron stove could heat it. She calculated the insulating value of packed sod at various thicknesses. She calculated the thermal mass of the surrounding earth and its capacity to moderate temperature swings. Then she set down her pencil and looked at what she had drawn and decided it was right. In July of 1881, she began to dig. She worked in the evenings after the field work was done, an hour, sometimes two, before the light failed entirely. She was building the chamber inside the existing barn, earth bermed into the northern wall, with the surrounding prairie soil serving as insulation on three sides. She excavated the space by hand, carrying the displaced earth out in buckets and scattering it across the property in small amounts, so that no pile would give away what she was doing. This was not vanity. This was not secrecy for its own sake. Eleanor had thought carefully about why she was keeping this project to herself, and she had arrived at an answer that had nothing to do with pride or embarrassment. She had watched enough homesteaders fail, watched them fail publicly with their neighbors' opinions, embedded in every decision they made, to understand that a project like this one needed to be built without the weight of other people's doubt pressing down on it. Not because their doubt would be unreasonable, because it would be constant and she would have to spend energy responding to it, and that energy was better spent on the work itself. There was something else too, something she was slower to admit to herself. If this failed, she wanted it to fail privately. She had made enough public mistakes in the last 2 years, miscalculated the severity of a late frost, misjudged the market timing for her, wheat overestimated her fence line against a neighbor's cattle, to know the particular weight of error witnessed by a community. A widow proving up a homestead claim alone was already the subject of more observation than she found comfortable. She did not need to add a failed underground construction project to the catalog of her struggles. But beneath both of those reasons, deeper than either of them, was the one she was slowest to reach and most reluctant to name. She was building this because Niels had told her the land could shelter them, and she had not fully believed him when he said it, and she needed to find out whether he had been right. Not for his sake, he was beyond needing to be proved right or wrong. For her own. Because she had married a man who understood something about this land that she was only beginning to grasp, and she needed to know whether the understanding was sound or whether it was the beautiful, impractical vision of a man who had died before the land had a chance to disappoint him. So she dug in the evenings, and she scattered the earth, and she told no one. In those evenings alone in the partial dark, with nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the scratch of the spade against soil, she thought of Niels often. Not with the sharp edge of grief that had dominated the first months after his death, but with something softer, a sense of conversation almost continuing across whatever distance separated them now. He had loved this land with an uncomplicated devotion that she had always found both baffling and beautiful. She had come to the Dakota Territory out of love for him. She had stayed out of stubbornness and necessity, and something she could not name that had more to do with the land itself than she had admitted. The land can shelter us if we let it. She had thought about those words a great deal in the months since she had first pressed her palm against that barn floor. She had come to believe they meant something more practical than poetic. Niels had been right in that way he had of being right without fully understanding the mechanism of his own rightness. The land could shelter them, the earth itself with its deep, steady warmth and its extraordinary insulating properties and its availability in unlimited quantities to anyone willing to do the work. The land was the material. She just had to build the right structure around it. It was not sentimental to feel this way. It was engineering. 3 times during those 14 months she came close to stopping. The first time was in March of 1881. She had been excavating a particularly stubborn section of subsoil dense clay-rich earth that resisted the spade in a way that softer soil did not, and she misjudged the lateral support in a section of wall. A small collapse, nothing catastrophic perhaps, 2 cubic feet of earth giving way and partially filling the space she had spent 3 evenings creating. She stood looking at it in the dim lantern light covered in soil, her arms aching from shoulders to wrists, and a question formed itself with unusual clarity. Am I smart enough for this? She did not answer it immediately. She sat on an overturned bucket in the partial dark and let the question sit there and breathe. Then she thought about the notebook and the flour barrel. She thought about the calculations she had done and redone until she was certain of them. She thought about the test holes and their consistent measurements. She thought about the physics, which did not change based on her emotional state. She picked up the spade. The second time was in July of that same year. A dry summer had pushed her crops toward failure, and the small amount of money she had set aside for chamber materials had been redirected to seed for a second planting that she hoped would make up the difference. She stood in her kitchen, looking at the account book, and the numbers did not resolve into anything hopeful, no matter how long she looked at them. The chamber sat in the barn, half completed, a hole in the ground that had cost her months of labor and money she did not have. Am I strong enough to keep going? She looked at the account book. She looked at the chamber materials stacked against the wall. She went outside and stood at the test hole she had dug in the southwest corner of the property and pressed her palm against the earth at 4 feet depth and felt that steady, impossible warmth coming up through the soil. She sold one of her 3 cows to cover the shortfall. The third time was in October of 1881, when the weather closed in early, and she found herself with a nearly complete chamber in an approaching winter that seemed indifferent to her schedule. She was mortaring the final section of stone floor by lamplight, her fingers stiff with cold, despite her gloves, and the question that came to her that night was the strangest of the 3. Does any of this matter if no one ever needs it? She held that question for a long time. It was a different kind of question than the other 2, less about competence and more about purpose. She had built this thing in secret for an emergency that might never come at a cost she could barely afford. If the winters ahead proved mild, if the prairie gave them the mercy of ordinary cold rather than killing cold, this chamber would sit unused and unknown beneath her barn for the rest of her tenure on this property. And she found, when she really examined the question, that she was all right with that possibility. She was not building this for recognition. She was not building it to prove something to her neighbors. She was building it because the math said it would work, and because the math in this case, unlike in almost every other domain of human endeavor, was not a matter of opinion. She finished the mortaring, she stocked the shelves, she tested the stove, and then she waited with the particular patience of someone who has done everything that can be done and understands that the rest is not in their hands. The chamber was 12 feet by 14 feet by 7 feet high, earth bermed into the barn's northern wall on 3 sides, with the fourth side, the exposed interior wall built from mortared limestone blocks salvaged from the creek bed 3 miles east of her property. She had made 37 trips with the borrowed wagon to haul those stones, fitting each one against its neighbors, with the care Niels had taught her in the first year of their marriage, when they were laying the foundation of the house together. The floor was flat stone, the same Dakota limestone from the same creek bed, laid in a pattern she had worked out to maximize thermal absorption and ease of cleaning. She had placed the first stone on a Thursday afternoon in late August of 1881, pressing it into the prepared earth base and checking its level with the small brass tool Niels had carried from Minnesota. She had laid every subsequent stone herself, one at a time, in the evenings after the fieldwork was done. The walls were packed sod 18 inches deep, faced on the interior with a layer of clay-mixed plaster that kept the soil from crumbling. She had installed a small cast-iron stove with a flue that vented through a shared chimney with the barn's main heating system. The ventilation was the piece she had spent the most time on: 2 air channels, one near the floor for intake, one near the ceiling for exhaust, positioned at angles she had calculated to create natural convection without creating drafts. The entrance was through a heavy plank door set into what appeared from the barn's main space to be a solid hay storage wall. Unless you knew to look for it, you would walk past it 100 times and never guess what was behind it. Behind the door on the shelves lining the east and west walls, she had stored 6 months of provisions: salt pork, hard wheat, cornmeal, preserved vegetables from the previous summer's garden, dried apples, smoked venison, 60 pounds of coffee, blankets, 12 of them, including 2 Hudson's Bay wool blankets she had saved 3 years to buy, medical supplies, willow bark poultices, clean linen laudanum for genuine emergencies, lamp oil, candles, matches in 6 waterproof tins, tools, a small axe, a handsaw, a whetstone. The total materials cost had been $38, assembled over 14 months from the margins of what the farm produced. It was money she could not afford to spend, and spent anyway. The first 3 people to see it in the autumn and early winter of 1881 thought she had made a serious mistake. Harold Covey arrived in November of 1881, 11 days after she had completed the chamber. He was 46 years old, a former Union Army quartermaster who had managed supplies for 3,000 soldiers through campaigns in Tennessee and Georgia, and had brought those logistical habits to the Dakota Territory when he homesteaded in 1873. He was a thick-bodied man with iron-gray hair kept short and neat, and he carried himself with the absolute deliberateness of someone accustomed to having his assessments treated as fact. He had heard through Ezra Hollis, who had apparently noticed the quantity of limestone she had been hauling from the creek, that Eleanor was building something unusual in her barn. He came to see it not with the curiosity of a neighbor, but with the bearing of an inspector who has already formed his conclusions and is present merely to confirm them. Eleanor showed him the chamber without preamble. She pulled aside the hay bales that covered the door, opened it, and stepped back. She had decided before he arrived to let him see the space and draw his own initial conclusions before she said anything. Harold ducked through the entrance and stood in the chamber for a long moment, doing what she recognized as a quartermaster's inventory. His eyes moved systematically across the shelves, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. He tapped the sod wall with his knuckles. He pressed his palm against the limestone blocks. He looked at the stove and traced the flue line with his eyes up to where it disappeared through the ceiling. The temperature inside was 56 degrees. Outside, the November air was in the low 40s. Then he shook his head. He did it slowly, with the gravity of a man delivering a diagnosis he has delivered before. And what he said was not simple dismissal. Eleanor would have found that easier to process. What he said was measured and specific and came from a genuine place of experience. Too many dependencies, he said. The stove depends on wood supply. The wood supply depends on your ability to get to it. The ventilation depends on both channels staying clear. Each of those is a single point of failure, and when they are chained together the way you have built them here, a failure at any link collapses the whole system. He was not finished. In 1864, I had a junior officer present me with a supply route that was on paper the most efficient logistics solution I had seen in the entire war. Every component was optimized. It was genuinely impressive work. And it failed at the first serious test because optimized systems have no margin. Your regular barn has margin. It is inefficient in the ways that matter. It lets cold in. It wastes heat. But when something goes wrong, you can see what is wrong and fix it while it is happening. This chamber, if something fails in the middle of a 3-day blizzard at 40 below, you are solving an engineering problem in the dark with frozen hands while people depend on you. He paused. He looked around the space one more time. When this fails, he said, I will be the one who helps you rebuild. He meant it as an offer. Eleanor heard it clearly for what it also was. He left, and she stood alone in the chamber for a while after his horse's hoofbeats faded, and she thought about what he had said. Not defensively. She thought about it the way she thought about all serious criticisms of her work, as information that might require her to revise something. She thought Harold Covey's criticism was not entirely accurate, but it was not inaccurate in the ways that made you want to dismiss it. He had identified real risks. She made 2 modifications to the ventilation design the following week. Agnes Brzenk arrived 10 days after Harold in late November of 1881. She was 51 years old, a Polish immigrant who had come to the Dakota Territory in 1877 with her daughter and a practical intelligence that had been sharpened rather than softened by a life that had included more difficulty than most. She was a compact woman with gray-streaked dark hair and hands that spoke of decades of serious work, and she approached the chamber inspection with those hands clasped behind her back in a way that somehow suggested she was trying not to touch anything before she had fully assessed it. She spent longer inside the space than Harold had. She moved around the perimeter, examining the wall construction, testing the floor stones with her heel, calculating sight lines from the entrance to the back wall. She opened the stove's firebox and looked inside. She looked at the air vents for a long time. One exit, she said finally in English that retained the cadences of Polish underneath it. One stove, one chimney, 3 points of failure, and I count more. The conception is not wrong, Agnes said, making an important distinction. Underground storage, I know this from old country. This principle works for keeping things stable. But for living, for surviving in winter, this is different calculation. You put people in here for 3 days, you have a problem with air quality before you have a problem with cold. You have a problem with moisture from breathing before you have a problem with temperature. She looked at Eleanor directly. You are not wrong that the earth is warm below. You are maybe wrong that warm below is the whole problem to solve. She left, and Eleanor stood at the entrance of the chamber and thought about moisture and air quality for the rest of that evening and made adjustments to her ventilation calculations that she should have made already, and was quietly grateful for the inspection. Owen Gable came in December of 1881, the last of the 3. He was 27 years old, born in 1855 in a covered wagon somewhere on the Dakota Prairie, which made him a kind of native that neither the European immigrants nor the East Coast transplants could quite claim. He worked as a ranch hand on the Hollis property and stopped by Eleanor's farm every few weeks with no particular purpose beyond being the kind of person who checked on his neighbors. He was quiet by nature. When he looked at the chamber, he took his time, and the time he took felt different from Harold's inspection and different from Agnes's, less like cataloging and more like listening. When he spoke, he said the thing that stayed with Eleanor the longest. "It is well built. The craftsmanship is solid. I can see the thinking in every piece of it." He looked at the walls, the floor, the ventilation channels. "But here is what worries me. The prairie does not punish stupidity the way people think. Stupidity you can sometimes get lucky through. What the prairie punishes is the moment you commit completely to a system you have not been able to test under real conditions. Because that moment always comes when you have no alternative." He looked at her. "You have built something with no backup. Not because you are not smart, I think you are very smart. But smart is not the same as tested. And out here, the difference between those two things is exactly the same as the difference between alive and not." He said it without cruelty and without condescension. He said it as a man who had grown up watching the prairie sort people by the quality of their contingency planning. He left, and Eleanor went into the chamber and sat on the floor with her back against the warm sod wall, and she let his words settle into her, the way cold settles into an uninsulated wall, finding every gap, getting all the way through. No backup. She thought about that for a long time. Then she went to her notebook and began planning what would become the chamber's secondary fuel storage. A separate cache of split wood accessible from inside the chamber through a small panel in the interior wall, positioned so that she would never have to open the main door during a storm to access emergency heat. Owen Gable's doubt had made the chamber better. She was not sure she would have designed that feature without it. She had found something else entirely in those 14 months of digging, something she had not planned for and could not have anticipated. It happened in the fourth month of excavation in late October of 1881, when she was extending the chamber's northern wall further into the earth than her original plans required, deepening the foundation by an extra 18 inches to improve the contact between the chamber's base and the deeper stable temperature soil below. Her spade hit something unexpected, a change in the soil composition that was too regular to be geological. A thin layer of ash, then below it, a pattern in the clay that she had not put there. She cleared the soil away carefully with her hands working by lamplight, patient and deliberate. What she found were the remnants of a ventilation channel, a deliberate engineered passage through the earth lined with fired clay rings, spaced at intervals she estimated at about 2 feet. She had seen something like this once in a book on indigenous building practices, borrowed from the territorial library. The Mandan people had built earth lodges across this territory for centuries. Sophisticated dome-shaped structures that use the Earth's thermal mass in precisely the way she was trying to use it, the ground as insulation, the deep soil as heat storage, natural ventilation to maintain air quality without losing warmth. The engineering principles she had derived by pressing her palm against a cold barn floor and running calculations in a marbled notebook were the same principles that had kept Mandan communities alive through Dakota winters for longer than any European presence on this continent. She had not invented anything. She had rediscovered it. She sat back on her heels and looked at that clay-lined channel in the lamplight for a long time. Then she thought about the ventilation design she had been working on and made 3 modifications based on what the Mandan engineers had understood about how air moved through Earth-sheltered space. The modifications were small but not trivial. When she tested the modified ventilation system the following week, the air quality in the sealed chamber at a sustained fire was noticeably better than it had been before. She was not the first person to understand what the earth beneath the Dakota Prairie could do. She was simply the latest in a long line that stretched back further than she could see. That knowledge that she was part of something larger than her own 14 months of work settled into her alongside the physics and the calculations, and it felt in a way she could not fully articulate like company. On a November morning in 1882, exactly 1 year and 1 month after she had completed the chamber, Ezra Hollis rode into her farmyard on his gray mare and told her that the barometer at the trading post had fallen faster than he had seen it fall in 23 years on the prairie. "Bring your stock inside," he said, his weathered face serious beneath the brim of his fur cap. "This one is going to be the killing kind." Eleanor nodded. She looked at the sky one more time, that greenish-gray light building on the northwest horizon, pressing down toward the earth with the specific weight of something that has made up its mind. She thought about Harold Covey and Agnes Berzank and Owen Gable. She thought about every hour of those 14 months. She thought about a clay-lined ventilation channel built by people who had understood this land for centuries before she arrived. She thought about a stone floor laid one piece at a time in the evenings of a long summer, using the same limestone she and Niels had used to build their hearth in the first autumn they were here, because the creek bed 3 miles east was the only source of flat stone within reasonable distance, and they had both known it and both gone there. She turned and walked toward the barn. Not quickly, not with panic, with the walk of someone who had already done everything that fear would suggest months and months before this moment. She opened the barn door and stepped inside. In the northwest corner, behind the hay bales and the hanging harnesses behind the heavy plank door that nobody who had not been shown would ever find, the chamber waited, dry and ready and holding its 54 degrees with the patience of the earth itself. Eleanor Marsh lit the stove. She watched the flame catch and settle. She felt the first faint warmth begin to rise from the iron plate and move through the space she had built with her own hands in the evenings of 14 months, one bucketful of earth at a time. Outside, the sky to the northwest had gone the color of iron, left too long in the weather. The wind was finding its voice. The storm was coming. And for the first time since she had pressed her palm against a cold barn floor in December of 1880 and felt the impossible warmth rising from the earth below, Eleanor Marsh was not afraid of it. The wind hit the barn like a physical verdict. Not a gust. Not the kind of wind that builds and retreats and builds again, the way ordinary prairie wind behaves, testing its own strength against whatever stands in its way. This was sustained and total, a wall of moving air that struck the barn's western face at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and did not relent. The whole structure shuddered, not the shudder of something about to fail, but the deep involuntary tremor of something solid being tested by something larger than itself. Eleanor felt it through the soles of her boots. She had spent the morning doing what could be done. The livestock were inside, all 3 milk cows and both draft horses, crowded into the main barn space, restless and warm, and generating the particular smell of large animals under stress. She had filled every water vessel she owned and brought them inside before they could freeze. She had checked the chamber's stove and its fuel supply 3 times, not because she doubted the supply, but because checking was the only useful thing left to do while waiting. The temperature outside had been 12 below zero when she last looked at the thermometer mounted beside the barn door. It was dropping at a rate that reminded her of the way water drains from a bucket with a hole in it, steadily, without pause, without concern for the things that depended on it holding. Inside the chamber, the stove had been burning for 2 hours. The temperature in that small earth-surrounded space had climbed from its resting 54 degrees to 68 and was still rising. The stone floor had absorbed enough heat that it was warm to the touch. The thick sod walls held every degree the stove produced, releasing nothing to the outside air. In the main barn, despite 5 large animals generating body heat, the temperature had already fallen to 15 degrees and was heading further down. Eleanor stood at the barn's interior and listened to the storm announce itself, and felt beneath the noise of it something she had not expected to feel. She felt ready. The first knock came at 20 minutes past 4. Not the sound of wind-driven debris against the barn wall. She had already cataloged that sound and filed it away. This was deliberate. The specific rhythm of a human fist striking wood, 3 blows, a pause, 3 more. The sound of someone who was still organized enough to knock in a pattern. She fought the barn door open against a wind that had climbed past 40 miles an hour, leaning her full weight into the task, and the cold hit her face like something solid. The temperature had dropped another 8 degrees in the 2 hours since she had last checked. The air was white, not with falling snow, but with snow that had already fallen and was being driven horizontally at a velocity that made the distinction between ground and sky largely irrelevant. 3 figures materialized out of the white. Harold Covey stood at the front, and Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life the particular quality of his stillness in that moment. A big man, 46 years old, a man who had managed supply lines for 3,000 soldiers and homesteaded this territory for 9 years, a man whose entire identity was built on the foundation of his own competence and the reliability of his own judgment. And he stood in the entrance of her barn with his wife's hand in his left hand and his youngest child pressed against his right side. And he looked at Eleanor Marsh, and he said nothing. Behind him, his wife Ellen, her face raw with windburn, one arm around their grandmother Ruth, who was 76 years old and whose breathing was audible even over the wind. 3 children, the oldest 14, the youngest 7, pressed together in a cluster behind their mother. Harold's roof had given way under the accumulated snow load at 2 in the afternoon, exactly when the wind hit. The structure had been sound. He had built it himself 9 years ago, using methods that had served him through 9 winters. It had not been insufficient engineering. It had been physics, more weight than any structure built that way could hold. Eleanor stepped back from the doorway. Harold Covey walked into the barn, and his family followed him, and the wind slammed the door behind them like a judgment. He stood in the barn's interior and took stock. His eyes went to the temperature, which you could feel without a thermometer, 15 degrees cold enough that his children's breath was making clouds that hung in the dim air without dissipating. His eyes went to the livestock clustered in their stalls. His eyes went to the walls where frost was already forming on the interior surface of the logs. Then his eyes went to the back of the barn, to the section of wall he had examined 13 months ago, with the bearing of a man confirming his own conclusions. Eleanor watched him look at it. She said, "There is something I need to show you." And she walked to the back wall and began moving the hay bales. Harold Covey watched her reveal the door. He watched her open it. He watched the air from inside the chamber reach out into the main barn space. Warm, dry, stable air that was 50 degrees warmer than the space they were standing in, and he made a sound that Eleanor had never heard from him before and could not have predicted. It was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when something he was certain of turns out to be wrong in a direction that saves his family's lives. She stepped back from the door without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The warmth said it. The temperature differential said it. The stone floor radiating heat into the space said everything that words would have been insufficient to express. Harold's youngest child, 7 years old, a boy named Thomas, who had been pressing his face into his father's coat since they had walked through the barn door, lifted his head, looked at the open chamber entrance, and walked toward the warmth, the way animals walk toward water, with complete instinctive trust. Harold Covey looked at Eleanor for a long moment, then he followed his son through the door. Agnes Brzenk arrived 40 minutes later, and she was not alone. Eleanor saw them through the gap she had cleared in the frost on the barn's small north-facing window. 3 figures moving through the white in a way that communicated urgency without panic. Agnes in the lead, her stride still purposeful, despite the wind that was trying to push her sideways. Behind her, her daughter Vera, 6 months pregnant, moving with the particular careful determination of someone who has made a decision to get somewhere and is not going to be stopped by anything as minor as a blizzard. And behind Vera, Agnes's grandson Piotr, 9 years old, small for his age, holding his grandmother's coat with both hands. Eleanor had the barn door ready. She timed it, opened it in the gap between 2 particularly strong wind gusts, held it, and Agnes walked through with the efficiency of someone who has been navigating obstacles her entire life. Vera came through. Piotr came through. Eleanor put her shoulder into the door and got it closed. Agnes stood in the barn interior and took stock with the same systematic gaze she had turned on the chamber 13 months ago. Temperature, livestock, frost on the walls, other people, and then the open door at the back of the barn through which warm light was visible and from which warm air was perceptibly moving. She looked at it for a moment. Something moved across her face that Eleanor could not fully name: recognition, perhaps, or the particular complex emotion of seeing that something you believe was wrong turns out to be right. Agnes Brzenk was not a woman given to public reckonings with her own errors. She processed things internally, reached her conclusions, and moved forward. But she stopped walking toward the chamber door. She stopped and she stood there, and Eleanor understood what was happening with the clarity of one woman reading another. Agnes had told Eleanor 13 months ago that this chamber would fail. She had been specific about the ways it would fail, and she had delivered that assessment with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about the question. Walking through that door was not a physical act. It was a statement. It was an acknowledgement made in front of witnesses that the judgment she had delivered with such confidence in November of 1881 had been wrong. Agnes Brzenk was 51 years old. She had survived more difficulty than most people encountered in 2 lifetimes. She was not a woman who bent easily, and that quality of unbending had kept her alive and had kept her family alive, and she was not wrong to value it. She stood 6 feet from the chamber door, and she did not move. Vera was shivering. The baby's weight shifted visibly as she adjusted her stance against the cold, and the movement communicated discomfort at a level below conscious decision. Vera wrapped her arms around her belly, not for warmth, but in that unconscious protective gesture that pregnant women make the body's most fundamental response to threat. Eleanor did not speak to Agnes. She did not offer reassurance or argument or any form of pressure. She turned and looked at Vera. That was all. Agnes looked at her daughter. She looked at the way Vera was holding herself. She looked at Piotr, who had already let go of her coat and was standing 3 feet closer to the chamber door, drawn by the warmth spilling out of it. Agnes walked through the door. She did not look at Eleanor as she passed. She did not need to. Eleanor did not need her to. Some understandings between women do not require the ceremony of eye contact to be complete. They kept coming. Ezra Hollis arrived with his 2 teenage sons at 5:30, all 3 of them showing the white patches on cheeks and earlobes that meant frostbite was already starting from their mile-and-a-half journey across open ground. Eleanor brought them inside the chamber, assessed the frostbite first degree on all 3, nothing lost yet, and began the slow warming process that the medical guides called gradual rewarming, which meant warm water and patience and keeping the affected tissue from being rubbed or compressed. A family she had not met before arrived at 6:15. The Erickson family, Swedish immigrants, father and mother, and 4 children, ranging from 2 to 11 years old, who had been on the road between Yankton and their new claim when the storm hit, and had seen Eleanor's barn through the white and walked toward it with the directness of people who have no other options. The father, a man of perhaps 35 with blonde hair frozen into a solid mass beneath his hat, spoke almost no English. Eleanor communicated with him entirely through gesture and eye contact, which proved sufficient for the immediate purposes. Owen Gable arrived last. He came in at 6:30 alone, moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been moving through serious cold for long enough that deliberateness is the only thing left. His horse had stopped 200 yards out, refused to go further, sat down in the snow with the absolute conviction of an animal that has reached its limit, and Owen had walked the rest of the way with his face turned sideways against the wind. His eyebrows were white with ice. The exposed skin around his eyes was the deep red that precedes frostbite. He walked into the barn, registered the temperature, registered the open chamber door, and the sounds of people coming from inside it, and turned to look at Eleanor. "How many?" he said. 17 with you," Eleanor said. "Come inside." He came inside. 17 people in a space designed for 6. Eleanor had known from the moment Harold Covey walked through the chamber door that the arithmetic was going to be the central problem of the next 48 hours. She had built the chamber for emergency occupancy by a small group herself, perhaps 2 or 3 neighbors, in an absolute worst case for a period not exceeding 48 hours. 17 people changed every calculation she had made. The warmth, at least, was not the immediate problem. 17 human bodies generated significant heat on their own, and the chamber's thermal mass had been accumulating warmth from the stove for 4 hours before the first person arrived. The temperature inside had stabilized at 71 degrees. Eleanor cracked the exhaust vent slightly to moderate the space rather than have it become uncomfortably warm. That was almost a strange thought, being too warm while outside the temperature was falling through 20 below zero and still going. She kept the stove burning steady. Not high, she did not need it high, but consistent feeding it. Split cottonwood in the measured rhythm she had calculated for a 6-person occupancy. The children fell asleep first, distributed across the blankets, Eleanor unfolded, and spread across the warm stone floor, arranged with the unconscious efficiency of children who are warm and fed and safe, and therefore trust completely that sleep is appropriate. Harold Covey's grandmother Ruth, 76 years old, 3 weeks into what sounded like the beginning of a lung infection, was the first medical concern. Eleanor settled her against the eastern wall, the warmest position in the chamber, with 3 blankets folded beneath her, and 2 over her, and began the willow bark tea that was the most reliable fever treatment in her medical kit. Harold sat beside Ruth with a posture that Eleanor read immediately, the posture of a man doing the only useful thing left to him, which was staying close. He was not helpless, Harold Covey, but he was in a position he had never been in before, a position where his particular skills, logistics, planning the management of physical systems had no application, and where the only thing that could help Ruth was a treatment he had not designed and did not fully understand, administered by a woman whose judgment he had publicly questioned 13 months ago. He sat with his grandmother, and he drank the willow bark tea Eleanor brought him, and he did not speak. The first 18 hours were manageable. The temperature in the chamber held between 68 and 73 degrees, despite the temperature outside dropping through 30 below. The children slept woke ate from Eleanor's provisions, salt pork and hard biscuit, and dried apple simple food, but caloric and warming, and slept again. The adults organized themselves with the unconscious efficiency of people who have experience in close quarters, taking turns at the better sleeping positions, managing noise so the children could rest, distributing blankets according to need rather than preference. Agnes Brzenk moved through the space with the authority of a woman accustomed to managing households under difficult conditions. She assessed who needed what with quick practical eyes and addressed needs before they were articulated. Eleanor noticed this and was grateful for it. She could not manage the chamber's physical systems and 17 people simultaneously, and Agnes's competence in the human dimension freed Eleanor to watch the stove, the ventilation, the temperature. Ruth's fever came down on the third willow bark treatment around midnight of the first night. Not gone, but lowered enough that her breathing steadied, and she slept without the labored quality that had been concerning Eleanor since the old woman arrived. Harold remained beside her. He did not sleep for the first 12 hours. The Erickson children, who had arrived with the hollow-eyed blankness of children who have been frightened beyond their capacity to process it, recovered with the extraordinary resilience of the very young. By the third hour inside the chamber, they were playing a silent hand game with Harold's youngest that required no shared language. Outside, at some point during the first night, 3 of Eleanor's milk cows died in the main barn. She knew it not from sound, the storm was too loud for that, but because the faint warmth that livestock generated, which she could detect as a subtle change in the air coming through the barn's interior wall, ceased. The horses survived. She had positioned them closest to the interior wall, and horses generate more heat than cattle, and it was enough. Barely. She did not tell anyone about the cows. There was nothing to be done, and the people around her had enough to carry. The crisis arrived at hour 18. Eleanor had been running the stove calculations in her head since the chamber reached capacity, updating them as she observed the actual burn rate against the fuel supply. The math had been telling her something she did not want to hear, and at hour 18, it stopped being a projection and became a fact. She was going to run out of fuel. Not immediately, not in the next hour, but by her best estimate, if the storm ran another 24 hours, and the quality of the wind told her it would run at least, that she would exhaust her wood supply sometime around hour 36. The secondary cache she had built into the interior wall after Owen Gable's visit would extend that by perhaps 4 hours, 40 hours. The storm might run 43. She did not panic. She sat with the stove and the numbers for a few minutes, running the calculation from different directions and arriving at the same answer each time, and she felt the particular weight of having planned carefully and still found the edge of what the planning covered. She had designed for 6 people. She had 17. The error was not in her mathematics. It was in her imagination. She had not imagined this specific number, this specific concentration of need. Owen Gable had told her in December of 1881 that she had built something with no backup. She had built the secondary fuel cache and believed that addressed it. It had not been enough. She was sitting with that fact, turning it over quietly, when she became aware that Owen himself was sitting down beside her. He had been awake for the last several hours. She realized she had seen him moving through the chamber in the patient way of someone who is managing his own alertness, carefully conserving it for when it would be needed. Now he sat beside the stove with the alert stillness of someone who has been watching a problem develop and has arrived at something. He looked at the stove, then at the fuel supply stacked against the south wall. "How long?" he said. There was no point in being indirect with a man who had clearly already assessed the situation himself. 36 hours if we hold steady," she said. "The storm might run 43. Owen nodded slowly. He had known. He had been calculating it himself, she understood, with the practical arithmetic of a man raised on this prairie. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking, the quiet of someone who has finished thinking and is choosing their words. "The Hollis wagon," he said. "The old supply wagon Ezra keeps in the northwest corner of the main barn. The bedboards are 2-inch oak." Eleanor looked at him. 2-inch oak will not burn as clean as split cottonwood," Owen said. "But it will burn 3, maybe 4 hours of additional fuel in those boards if we are careful about the size we cut them." He paused, looking at the chamber door. "I can get to it. If I go through the chamber door, cut left along the barn's interior wall, I can reach the wagon without going outside. Maybe 6 minutes total. The main barn is 15 below right now. 15 below. 6 minutes. Exposed skin begins losing sensation in 90 seconds at 15 below with the wind chill factor from the barn's inadequate insulation. 6 minutes was survivable, not comfortable, not without cost, but survivable. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the man who had told her 14 months ago that she had built a system with no backup, who was sitting beside her now, having quietly identified the backup she had missed. She understood something then that she had not fully understood before. Owen Gable had never been against what she was building. He had been for something she had left out of it. He was not a skeptic. He was a man who thought about the second step while other people were still planning the first. He had tried to tell her that in December of 1881, and she had heard it as doubt when it was actually something closer to collaboration. Two different minds looking at the same problem from different angles, arriving at pieces of the solution that the other had not seen. "Take Harold," she said. "2 sets of hands and he knows that wagon." Owen looked at Harold, who was already awake and watching them from across the chamber. Harold had been following the conversation with the focused attention of a man who has been a quartermaster and cannot stop doing logistical assessment even when he is trying to rest. Harold stood up without being asked. He pulled on his coat and moved toward Owen with the wordless efficiency of a man who has made a decision and sees no reason to discuss it further. They went out together through the chamber door. 8 minutes later, they came back, each carrying a stack of 2-inch oak boards under arms that were shaking with cold. They made 3 trips. Harold's face had gone the dangerous white on his cheekbones that Eleanor knew well, and she spent 10 careful minutes with warm water and gentle hands while he sat against the south wall and relearned how to feel his face. He did not complain. He sat still and let her work and looked at the oak boards stacked beside the stove. The boards went onto the fire at hour 22. They burned slower than cottonwood and with slightly more smoke, and Eleanor adjusted the ventilation to compensate, and the temperature in the chamber dropped to 66 degrees while the fire reestablished, and then climbed back to 69 and held. 43 hours. The fuel would last. It was the second night that Harold Covey spoke to her. Everyone else was asleep. Eleanor was tending the stove in the way she had tended it for 18 hours. Small adjustments, patient monitoring, the constant quiet attention of someone for whom a fire has become a living thing with needs and moods. Ruth was sleeping steadily, her fever lower than it had been that afternoon. Her breathing settling into something that sounded like genuine rest, rather than the labored unconsciousness of a body fighting itself. Harold sat down beside Eleanor at the stove. He had the posture of a man who has decided to say something and is taking his time with how to say it. He was quiet for a while. The fire talked in the way fires do, low, continuous, the language of controlled combustion in a small and well-made space. Then he said, "Chattanooga, November of 1864. Eleanor waited. "There was a junior lieutenant under my command, 22 years old, out of Ohio, engineering degree from a program that had produced some genuinely impressive officers. He came to me in October with a bridge design, a pontoon configuration for crossing the Tennessee River at a specific point, optimized for the weight of artillery and supply wagons." Harold looked at the fire. "It was the best piece of field engineering I had reviewed in 3 years of war. Every load calculation was correct. The anchoring system was solid. He had accounted for current speed, bank stability, everything I would have checked myself. I approved it in 20 minutes, which I almost never did." A pause. "The bridge held for 11 days. Then the fall rains came, and the river rose 4 feet in 6 hours, and the current changed character, the way mountain rivers do when they flood, not faster, but different, with a lateral pressure component that his calculations had not included, because there was no way to calculate it without having seen that specific river in flood conditions." Eleanor did not speak. 12 men. 4 of them had families I had personally met at some point during the campaign. I wrote 11 of the 12 letters myself. He was quiet for a moment. "After that, I made a rule for myself. I would not trust any system I had not personally observed fail and recover, or fail and been rebuilt from what I had learned. Not because systems designed by smart people are untrustworthy, but because there is always a variable that can only be found by the thing the system has not yet encountered." The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind was doing its worst. The temperature had reached 42 below sometime in the last hour, and the barn walls were vibrating at a frequency that Eleanor could feel in her chest. She said, "You were not wrong about the principle." Harold looked at her. The principle is sound, she said. Every system has the variable it has not encountered yet. I had one tonight I built for 6 people and had 17, and I ran into my fuel limit earlier than I had planned for. She looked at him steadily. Owen found the backup, which is almost exactly what you told me I was missing. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not the dramatic shift of a man having a revelation, but the small, careful movement of someone filing a piece of information into the right place. The bridge lieutenant, he said. His name was Carver, James Carver. He survived the war and went home to Ohio. I never wrote to him, never told him that the failure wasn't a failure of his, thinking it was a failure of the river not being the same river it appeared to be. Perhaps you should, Eleanor said. Harold considered this for a long moment. Perhaps I should, he said. He went back to sit beside Ruth after that, and Eleanor tended the fire, and the storm outside reached its peak, somewhere in the small hours of the second night, the wind at 78 miles per hour, the temperature at 42 below, a force that made the barn walls vibrate, and the darkness feel absolute. Inside the chamber, the temperature held at 69 degrees. The stone floor was warm beneath 17 sleeping people. The sod walls absorbed the wind's assault without transmitting it. The tons of prairie earth surrounding them on 3 sides maintained their ancient, indifferent, life-preserving warmth. Eleanor fed the fire a piece of 2-inch oak and listened to the storm do its worst, and she thought about James Carver in Ohio and about the Mandan engineers who had built their ventilation channels into this same earth 2 centuries ago, and about Niels and about the variable you can only find by encountering it. She had encountered hers tonight, and she had not encountered it alone. The fire burned steadily. The earth held everything it was asked to hold. Outside, the storm buried the farmyard in drifts that would take weeks to fully clear, pushed the temperature to the lowest reading anyone in the territory would record. That winter drove snow through every gap in the main barn until the inside walls were furred with ice. It killed 3 cows and bent fence posts and buried the chicken coop entirely beneath 6 feet of consolidated white. It did not get through the sod walls. It did not reach the stone floor. It did not touch the 17 people sleeping and waking and breathing their way through the night in the space Eleanor Marsh had built, one bucketful of earth at a time. Outside, the Dakota Territory was showing its worst face, the face that had killed families and frozen cattle solid in their fields and buried entire homesteads under drifts tall as houses. Inside the chamber, a 7-year-old boy slept with his cheek pressed against warm stone, one hand still loosely holding his father's coat. The earth held. The earth remembered. The earth did exactly what it had been doing for centuries before any of them arrived, and would continue doing for centuries after all of them were gone. It held. The wind stopped at 20 minutes past 7 on the morning of the 3rd day. Not gradually. Not the way storms usually end, with a slow diminishment, the gusts spacing themselves further apart, the pauses between them lengthening until the pauses become the weather and the wind becomes the memory. This storm ended the way it had begun, decisively, with the abruptness of something that had finished what it came to do and saw no reason to linger. Eleanor was awake when it happened. She had been awake for most of the 3rd night, tending the fire in the particular vigilant quiet of someone who has accepted sleeplessness as the cost of keeping 17 people warm. She heard the change before she felt it, a shift in the quality of the barn's vibration, the low structural hum of walls under sustained wind load, dropping away into a silence so complete that it woke 3 of the sleeping adults within 30 seconds of its arrival. She sat with that silence for a long moment. 43 hours. She looked at the stove, which had consumed the last of the oak boards 4 hours ago and was now burning the final quarter of her original cottonwood supply at the careful, rationed pace she had maintained through the night. The temperature in the chamber had dropped to 66 degrees in the last 2 hours. Still survivable, still far beyond anything the main barn could have managed, but lower than she would have liked the fire's last argument against the cold. She looked at the 17 people around her. Most were asleep. Harold's youngest had migrated at some point in the night to sleep pressed against his father's side, one small hand still clutching Harold's coat. Ruth was breathing with a steadiness that had been absent for the first 20 hours. The willow bark and the warmth had done their work, not completely, not permanently, but enough for now. The Erickson children were a pile of tangled limbs and shared blankets in the northeast corner. 4 small faces slack with the total unconsciousness of children who have finally processed their fear and let it go. Agnes Brzenk was awake, Eleanor suspected she had been awake longer than she had let on. The woman had a capacity for stillness that made it difficult to tell, but her eyes had the particular clarity of someone whose mind had been working through the night while her body rested. She was looking at the ceiling of the chamber, where the clay plaster showed a faint line of moisture from the accumulated breath of 17 people over 43 hours. Agnes noticed Eleanor looking at her. She tilted her head toward the ceiling, indicating the moisture line, in a gesture that communicated, "I told you about moisture." Eleanor looked at the moisture line. Then she looked at Agnes. "It held," Eleanor said quietly. Agnes looked at the moisture line for another moment. Then slowly she nodded. The specific nod of a person who is updating a conclusion they had held with significant confidence. Not theatrical, not a performance of concession. The small internal movement of a rigorous mind encountering evidence and responding to it the only honest way available. That exchange, 6 words and a nod, was enough. Owen Gable and Ezra Hollis dug them out. It took 2 hours. The snow on the downwind side of the barn had drifted to 17 feet, a hard-packed wall of white that had filled the space between the barn's eastern face and the fence line, completely burying the fence post, the chicken coop, and the lower third of the barn wall entirely. The barn door itself was blocked from the outside by 8 feet of consolidated drift with the density of something you could have cut into blocks and stacked. Owen had found the barn's small north-facing window, which was on the windward side, and had accumulated only 2 feet of drift. He went through it first alone into the bone-still air of a morning that was 19 below zero and felt, after 43 hours of storm, almost peaceful by comparison. He assessed the drift situation from the outside, came back through the window, and reported in the economical language of someone who has surveyed a problem and knows exactly what it requires. They worked from inside and outside simultaneously. Owen outside with the grain shovel cutting into the drift in the methodical way of a man who grew up digging out after blizzards and knows the rhythms of it. Ezra's older son inside the barn using a spade to clear the interior side of the door of the snow that had infiltrated through the gaps in the frame overnight. Harold Covey working beside the boy with a second spade, moving in the steady, efficient way of a man who needs to be doing something physical after 43 hours of enforced stillness. Eleanor did not help with the digging. She was doing the other thing that needed doing, assessing the people who would soon have to return to 19 below air after 43 hours in a 66-degree chamber. She worked her way through the group with methodical care, knowing that this specific transition, warm to cold, sheltered to exposed, carried its own risks, separate from the storm itself. Ruth first. The old woman's fever had broken on the second night, but her lungs were still compromised, and 19 below was not air you wanted to put compromised lungs into without ensuring a heated interior was waiting at the other end. There was an alternative. Eleanor decided Ruth would stay in the chamber until her family's house situation was confirmed and a properly heated space could be guaranteed. Harold received this without argument, with Eleanor thought the quiet relief of a man who had been hoping someone would say exactly that. Vera next, 6 months pregnant, having spent a night in extreme cold before reaching shelter. The baby was moving strongly. Eleanor had checked twice and Vera's color was good, but caution was not the same as excessive caution, and Eleanor saw no reason to treat Vera's situation as anything other than what it was. Agnes's house was standing. Eleanor would confirm its structural integrity before Vera went back inside. The Erickson children had come through better than anyone had a right to expect. The father Lars Eleanor had learned through Ezra's fragmentary Swedish, shook her hand when she indicated the children were well. He held her hand for a moment after the handshake ended, with the particular grip of someone communicating something for which neither of their languages had the right word. She understood him perfectly. The door came open at 9:30. Cold air pushed in through the gap. Real cold, 19 below, the specific dry bite of Dakota winter air after a major storm, different from the wind-driven cold of the blizzard itself. Cleaner somehow, more honest. The kind of cold that does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. The people who could go outside went outside. Eleanor was the last through the door. She stood in her own farmyard and looked at what 43 hours of storm had made of the world she knew. The landscape was transformed in the way that only major blizzards transform landscapes. Not incrementally, not in ways you could have watched happening, but completely, as if someone had taken the familiar ground and replaced it overnight with a version that shared the same coordinates, but none of the same contours. The drifts were sculpted by the wind into shapes of strange beauty, smooth curves and sharp edges that caught the morning light at angles that made them look carved rather than accumulated. The sky above was the specific blue that follows major Dakota storms, a blue so saturated and absolute that it seemed to exist at a different resolution than the ordinary sky, as if the storm had scoured away a layer of atmosphere and left something more fundamental underneath. Her chicken coop was gone, not destroyed, buried. She would find it intact under 6 feet of consolidated snow when the thaw came in April. Her fence line on the eastern boundary was invisible. The wagon Ezra had left in the yard was a smooth white mound with no visible angles. 3 feet of snow covered the roof of the barn in an unbroken sheet. Her house stood, the walls were sound, the roof intact. She stood in the blue-white morning and cataloged all of this with the systematic attention she brought to every assessment. Then she let herself simply look at it, the extraordinary altered world the storm had made for a moment that had nothing to do with assessment. She was alive. All 17 of them were alive. The chamber had done what she had built it to do. Harold Covey gathered everyone in the farmyard at 10 o'clock. Not by explicit arrangement. Eleanor had not asked him to do this, and he had not announced it. It happened with the organic authority of a man who has spent his life managing groups of people and whose instinct for the necessary moment is simply part of how he moves through the world. He stood in the snow among the people who had sheltered in Eleanor's chamber, and they arranged themselves around him with the unconscious deference of people who have been through something significant together and are still in the immediate aftermath of it. Eleanor was standing at the edge of the group near the barn door. She was already thinking about the sequence of work that lay ahead. The surviving livestock needed water, and feed the chamber needed to be ventilated and cleaned. She needed to assess the barn roof's structural integrity under its snow load. She was not particularly thinking about Harold Covey. Then he spoke, and she stopped thinking about the sequence of work. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to. The morning was absolutely still, the storm's silence, as total as the storm's violence had been, and his voice carried across the farmyard without effort. I want to say something that I should have said differently 13 months ago. He looked at Eleanor, not at the group, at her specifically directly, which meant the group turned to look at her too, and Eleanor had the sudden experience of 17 pairs of eyes finding her face at once. She had not expected this. I came to this woman's barn in November of 1881, Harold said, and she showed me something she had built with 14 months of her own labor and money she could not spare. And I stood in what she had built, and I told her it was too complex. I told her there were too many ways it could fail. I told her that conventional methods were more reliable than what she had done. He paused. I was wrong about the engineering. She had solved every problem I identified and several I had not thought to look for. I was wrong about her judgment. And I was wrong to say what I said the way I said it, with the confidence of a man who has confused the length of his own experience with the limits of what is possible. The farmyard was very quiet, 19 below zero, and nobody moved. This chamber held 17 people through 43 hours of the worst storm any of us will likely see in our lifetimes. The temperature outside dropped to 42 below. The temperature inside never fell below 66 degrees. 3 cows died in the main barn, which was built the conventional way. Nobody died in that chamber, including my grandmother, who would not have survived this night in any structure I know how to build. He held Eleanor's gaze. I have been wrong before. I will be wrong again. But I want to be the kind of man who says so plainly in front of the same people who heard me be wrong the first time. He stopped speaking. The farmyard held the particular quality of silence that follows words that have landed exactly where they were aimed. Eleanor looked at Harold Covey, this large, certain man who had walked into her barn 13 months ago with the bearing of an inspector and left with the bearing of a man confirming conclusions he had already drawn. She looked at him standing in her snow-buried farmyard at 10 in the morning, saying the true thing in front of everyone. She thought about Chattanooga and James Carver and 12 letters, and the variable that only reveals itself when the system encounters what it has not yet encountered. She said, "You found the backup when I needed one. That is not a small thing." Something in Harold's face settled, not relief exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something and has been given permission to set it down. He nodded once, a small, deliberate movement, and that was the end of it between them. Everything else that needed to be said had been. Agnes said nothing in front of the group. This was entirely consistent with Agnes Brzezinck, who had never in Eleanor's experience used a public moment to accomplish what could be done privately and more honestly. She waited until the group had begun to disperse, people moving toward their own assessments of damage, toward the practical work of determining what the storm had cost them, and then she appeared at Eleanor's side with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has decided something and is implementing it without ceremony. She took Eleanor's right hand in both of hers. Agnes's hands were the hands of 51 years of serious work, rough, strong, warm, despite the cold, completely certain of themselves. She held Eleanor's hand and looked at her with dark eyes that had seen more kinds of difficulty than Eleanor could fully imagine, and she said in the careful English that retained the cadences of Polish underneath it, "In my country, there is a way of saying the ground knows more than the people standing on it. My grandmother said this when I was young. I thought it was an old woman's talk, the kind of wisdom that sounds true without being useful." She paused. Her hands tightened slightly on Eleanor's. "It is not old woman's talk." She released Eleanor's hand. She turned and walked toward where Vera was sitting on a cleared section of fence rail, her hands folded over her belly, her face turned up to the blue morning sky with the expression of someone experiencing the specific joy of being alive on the other side of something that could have gone differently. Agnes sat down beside her daughter and put one arm around Vera's shoulders. Vera leaned into her. Eleanor watched them for a moment, then went to check on the horses. She found Owen Gable already in the barn when she got there, working his way along the roof beams with the careful eye of someone who knows what stress failure looks like in timber before it becomes catastrophic. He moved through the space without hurrying, pressing his palm against each major junction, checking the fit of the joints where the roof met the walls. "Beams look sound," he said when she came in. "Beams look sound," she agreed, looking up at the same points he had been examining. He came down from the beam he had been checking and stood in the main barn space, and there was a quality of stillness to him that she recognized as the precursor to something being said. "I have been thinking," Owen said, "about what I told you in December of 1881. Eleanor waited. "I told you that you had built something with no backup. I was right about the missing backup." He looked at her steadily with the directness of a man who has grown up in a place where saying exactly what you mean is not a social preference, but a survival habit. "But I was thinking about it wrong. I thought no backup meant the foundation of the idea was flawed, that the gap proved the whole thing was unsound. What it actually meant was that the idea was almost complete, one piece short, the piece I could see from where I was standing." He paused. "You built the chamber. I saw the gap in it. Tonight we needed both. That is not a story about one of us being right and the other wrong. That is a story about two different vantage points being necessary to see the whole thing." Eleanor looked at him. He was 28 years old, born on this prairie, and he had just described the architecture of collaboration more precisely than most people managed in a lifetime. "You found the oak boards," she said. "You built the chamber that made the oak boards matter," he said simply. "Without what you built, a pile of oak boards in a barn is just lumber." She almost smiled. "And without the oak boards, the chamber runs out of heat at hour 40. "Then we both did something necessary," Owen said with the equanimity of someone who has resolved a question to his own satisfaction and does not feel the need to continue discussing it past the point of resolution. They checked the remaining roof beams together, working in the comfortable quiet of two people who have been through something and do not need to keep talking about it to understand what it meant. The weeks that followed moved with the specific quality of time in the aftermath of a near thing, slightly slower than ordinary time, slightly more vivid, as if the storm had left the air cleaner and the light sharper along with everything else. 11 people had died in the surrounding territory during those 43 hours. Travelers caught on open roads, an elderly couple whose chimney had collapsed, families and structures that simply could not hold against 42 below and 78-mile-per-hour wind. The newspaper in Yankton would call it the worst blizzard in 23 years of territorial records. Agricultural losses across the region were significant: cattle and horses. Frozen grain stores, buried or damaged equipment lost under drifts that would not fully clear until March. On Eleanor's property, 3 cows, some fencing, the chicken coop, which emerged from the snow in April intact and perfectly usable. The disproportion between what the storm cost her and what it cost others was not lost on anyone. Word moved through the community the way word moves in small communities, specifically personally carried from neighbor to neighbor with the details intact. Not a story about a shelter that worked, but a story about Eleanor Marsh's chamber described with the precision of people who had been inside it. The temperature differential, the stone floor, the ventilation, the provisions, the specific numbers of hours in people and degrees of cold. People who had sheltered there described it to people who had not, and those people described it to others, and within 3 weeks, Eleanor had received visits from 22 different homesteaders who wanted to see it for themselves. She showed every one of them. She walked them through the construction principles in the plain language of someone explaining something they understand completely. She drew diagrams on whatever paper was available. She answered questions until the questions ran out. She turned no one away. By February of 1883, 4 families had begun construction on similar chambers. By the following autumn, 11 families in the county had built earth-berm shelters using variations of her design, some freestanding rather than barn-integrated, some using limestone rather than sod for the walls. One ambitious family building a chamber large enough to hold 30 people, which their neighbors thought was excessive, until the winter of 1884 arrived and proved otherwise. In May of 1883, a man named James Whitworth arrived from the Territorial Agricultural Extension Office. He was a trained engineer from Chicago, 38 years old, with surveying equipment and the careful skepticism of someone sent to assess a folk engineering claim. He spent 3 days measuring and testing, taking temperature readings at multiple points in the chamber at multiple times of day, examining the ventilation system with instruments Eleanor did not own. His report, which arrived in August, concluded that she had independently developed a shelter system incorporating geothermal mass, passive thermal regulation, and stratified ventilation that exceeded conventional structures in heat retention by an estimated 340%. It recommended the design for wider application across the Northern Territories. She read the report once. She set it down. She went outside to check the fence line on the eastern boundary, which still had 2 posts that needed replacing since the spring thaw had shifted the ground. She was not indifferent to the report. She understood what it would do for the credibility of the design and for the speed at which other families would build similar chambers. She was glad of it. But she had known the engineering was right before James Whitworth arrived with his instruments, and his confirmation of it did not change the fact of it. The fence posts still needed replacing. A reporter from the Yankton paper came in the summer of 1883. His name was Fletcher, he was perhaps 25, and he had the enthusiasm of someone covering his first significant story and the inexperience of someone who had not yet learned that the most important thing a subject says is usually the last thing, not the first. He asked her if she had invented a new kind of shelter. She told him she had not. She told him about Norwegian Stauber construction building traditions her family had carried from Scandinavia in the form of stories and practices her grandfather had described when she was young. She told him about the Mandan earth lodges and the 200-year-old ventilation channel she had found while digging, which had taught her things she had not thought to calculate. She told him about the Icelandic turf houses she had read about in the agricultural journals, about the sod construction practices of plain settlers from Nebraska north through the territories. I adapted solutions that already existed, she told Fletcher. The real work was being willing to learn from sources that conventional practice tends to overlook. The land was already telling people how to do this. I listened to what it was saying, and I learned from the people who had been listening longer than I had. Fletcher wrote a good article. Eleanor read it, corrected 2 factual errors in her head, and used the paper to start the kitchen fire the following morning because it was good dry newsprint and the autumn mornings were getting cold. She did not apply for a patent. She had considered it briefly and decided against it with the same systematic clarity she brought to every decision. A patent was a boundary. It converted knowledge into property, and property created the conditions under which people decided not to build something because they could not afford the license or could not find the owner or simply felt the idea did not belong to them. The design she had developed was drawn from knowledge that had never belonged to any single person. It was Mandan and Norwegian and Icelandic, and the accumulated observation of every person who had ever pressed their palm against cold earth and noticed the warmth beneath. She had no right to own it. She had only the right to use it and to share it. She gave away every copy of the drawings anyone asked for. She spent hours with families who came to learn the construction process. She wrote a detailed construction guide in the winter of 1883 and sent copies to every agricultural extension office in the Northern Territories, asking nothing in return. The knowledge moved the way. Knowledge moves when no one is trying to control it freely in all directions, adapted and modified by each person who received it to fit their specific conditions and resources. Some of the adaptations improved on what she had built. She learned from those too. The afternoon the storm ended after the farmyard had emptied and the first urgent work was done. Eleanor went back into the chamber alone. She had not planned to. She had been moving from task to task with the momentum that emergency creates in its aftermath, and she found herself standing in the chamber's entrance without quite knowing how she had arrived there. The space was empty of people for the first time in 43 hours. The stove had burned down to coals. The stone floor held the warmth it had absorbed over 2 days, radiating it gently into the space the way the earth itself had been radiating warmth into her calculations for over 2 years. The moisture line Agnes had noted on the ceiling was still visible. The blankets were folded in neat stacks by the east wall. Agnes's work done at some point in the third night, with the unconscious housekeeping instinct of a woman who cannot leave a space disordered. The provisions shelves had been drawn down from 6 months' supply to perhaps 4, but what remained was organized, consolidated, covered. She sat down on the stone floor with her back against the south wall, which was the warmest wall, and she looked at the space around her. These stones beneath her had come from the creek bed 3 miles east, carried in 37 wagon loads over 2 weeks in the late summer of 1881. She had laid them herself, fitting each one against its neighbors with the care that Niels had taught her. She had placed the first stone on a Thursday afternoon, pressing it into the prepared earth base and checking its level with the small brass tool that had traveled with them from Minnesota in the wagon that carried everything they owned. She had laid every subsequent stone herself one at a time in the evenings after the field work was done. They were the same stone, the same Dakota limestone from the same creek bed that she and Niels had used to build the hearth in the house during their first autumn here in 1878. She remembered carrying those stones together, Niels choosing each one with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that a hearth was not a decoration, but the center of a life, the place everything else organized itself around. He had taught her to read the face of a stone, to find the angle at which it would sit most stably, to fit two irregular surfaces together until they locked and held. She had not planned to use the same stone for the chamber floor. It had simply been the available stone. The creek bed 3 miles east was the only source of flat limestone within reasonable hauling distance, and she had gone there because she needed flat limestone, and that was where it was. But sitting on this floor now in the quiet aftermath of 43 hours that had proved everything she had built it for, she understood that the coincidence was not nothing. The same stone, the same hands, the same understanding that the right foundation makes the difference between a space that holds and a space that fails. She sat with that for a while. Not with grief. Grief had its own time and its own place, and those were not here or now. With something quieter and more permanent. The specific satisfaction of having seen a thing through from the moment of first understanding to the moment of final proof, and of knowing that the understanding had been sound. Niels had told her this land could shelter them if they let it. She had let it. He had been right. Between them, his vision and her labor, his instinct and her calculation, his faith in the land, and her 14 months of evenings working in the dark between them, the thing was true. She did not say this out loud. There was no one to say it to, and she had never been a woman who needed to say things out loud to know they were real. She sat on the stone floor of the chamber her husband had believed in before she had built it, and she let the warmth of the earth itself come up through the stone and into her, and she understood for the first time without qualification that she had done what she came here to do. 4 months after the storm, in the third week of March 1883, Vera Berzenk gave birth to a healthy son. Eleanor received the news from Agnes on a Wednesday morning, delivered in the same direct manner Agnes brought to everything. The baby was healthy, Vera was well. He weighed 8 pounds and 2 ounces and had his grandfather's jaw, which Agnes mentioned as if this were a mixed blessing at best. "We have given him a name," Agnes said. Eleanor waited. "Elias." Agnes looked at Eleanor with dark eyes that contained simultaneously the complete experience of 51 years of a difficult and entirely well-lived life. In the old scripture, Agnes said, Elias is the one kept alive through the long winter by hands that did not know him before the storm came. Strangers' hands. He lives because someone built the shelter before they knew he was coming. She said it plainly, without theater, in the way Agnes said everything that mattered. Eleanor thought about a clay-lined ventilation channel 200 years old in the earth beneath her barn. She thought about knowledge that belongs to no one, and therefore to everyone moving forward through time, in the hands of people who receive it and add to it and pass it on. She thought about a baby being born in March into a world still cold, but turning into a family that was alive, because of 43 hours in a room no one had known existed. She thought about the stone floor beneath her feet and about a creek bed 3 miles east, and about a man who had believed in the land before she had built the proof of it. "It is a good name," Eleanor said. Agnes stayed for coffee. They sat in the kitchen and talked about practical things, the condition of Agnes's east field after the snow, the price of seed corn at the Yankton Cooperative, whether the spring would be early or late. The way people talk when the important things have already been said, and what remains is the ongoing work of an ordinary life, which is not a lesser thing. The chamber served Eleanor Marsh for another 18 years until she sold the property in 1900 and moved to Yankton to live with her niece. In those 18 years, she used it twice more for emergencies, once in the brutal winter of 1887, sheltering 6 people for 21 hours, and once in 1893, when a late spring storm caught a traveling family on the road past her property. She maintained it with the same systematic care she brought to every other piece of her infrastructure, testing the stove quarterly, rotating the provisions annually, checking the ventilation channels every spring for debris or settling. The family who bought the property in 1900 used the chamber continuously through the harsh winters of the early 20th century. When electricity reached the area in 1923, they added electric lighting but left the structure otherwise unchanged because the structure worked, and working things do not require improvement simply because time has passed. In January of 1936, during the blizzard that would kill 47 people across South Dakota and Nebraska, 9 members of the Svoboda family sheltered in the chamber for 31 hours. The temperature outside reached 38 below. Every one of them survived. The youngest was 4 months old. Eleanor Marsh died in October of 1918 at the age of 70 in her niece's house in Yankton. She did not achieve great public recognition in her lifetime. She did not seek it. In the community around Yankton, her name came to mean a specific quality, a way of approaching problems that accounted for the worst case without being paralyzed by it, that invested in preparation, when preparation was expensive, and the need for it uncertain, that learned from sources other people overlooked. When people in those communities said someone was doing things the Marsh way, they meant someone who had already thought beyond the problem everyone else was still trying to identify. She never built another chamber. She never needed to. She had built one correctly, and she had shared everything she knew about how to build it, and 11 other families in the county had done the work themselves. That was the point. That had always been the point. The barn came down in 1957 when the property was sold to a corporate farming operation that needed the land cleared for different equipment. Before demolition engineering students from the state university documented the chamber with the thoroughness of people who recognized they were looking at something that warranted preservation in some form. They photographed every wall, every joint, every ventilation channel. They measured the thickness of the sod insulation and calculated its insulating value. They tested the thermal mass and ran the numbers on heat storage capacity. Their calculations confirmed what the 43 hours of November 1882 had already demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt. The sod insulation provided approximately R45. The thermal mass could store 38,000 BTU of heat energy per degree of temperature change. The ventilation moved air at the rate that modern building codes would eventually recommend for enclosed spaces of that volume. The stone floor appeared in the photographs exactly as Eleanor had laid it, fitted, precise, every stone seated correctly against its neighbor. The stones themselves were unremarkable Dakota limestone from the creek bed 3 miles east of the property. Anyone could have found them. Anyone could have hauled them. Anyone could have laid them. What made them remarkable was where they had been placed, and by whose hands, and for what reason, and what they had held. The drawings from that documentation are housed in the State Historical Society's archives. Anyone can look at them. Anyone can see the ventilation angles that borrowed from a 200-year-old Mandan channel. Anyone can trace the dimensions of the space that held 17 people through 43 hours of the worst storm in 23 years of territorial records. Anyone can look at the floor plan and understand, if they know what they are looking at, that the stone pattern reflects the way a particular woman thought about heat distribution, not as an abstract engineering problem, but as a practical question about where people would sleep and where warmth needed to reach, and how the two requirements could be reconciled in a space 12 feet by 14 feet by 7 feet high. The prairie is still there. You can drive through South Dakota on a November morning and see the sky turn that particular shade of greenish-gray that the old-timers called Widowmaker light, and you can feel the wind finding the gaps in whatever you are wearing, And you can understand in your body what it would have meant to face that sky in 1882, with a log barn and a wood stove, and the inadequate shelter of methods that had always worked somewhere else in more forgiving conditions. The homesteads are mostly gone. The barns have collapsed or been demolished. The particular community of people who sheltered in Eleanor Marsh's chamber: Harold and Ellen Covey, Agnes and Vera Brzezinski, Owen Gable, Ezra Hollis, and his sons, the Erickson family, who had been in the territory for 3 months and would stay for the rest of their lives. That community dispersed, as communities do, through death and movement, and the ordinary passage of time that takes everything eventually. But the knowledge does not disperse that way. It moves differently than people move. It gets written down and documented and passed from hand to hand in the specific form of drawings and instructions, in the stories that make instructions meaningful. It gets rediscovered by people who do not know they are rediscovering it, engineers who find the archive drawings and run the numbers and begin to understand that what they are looking at is not a historical curiosity, but a solution arrived at by a woman with a marbled notebook and a spade, in 14 months of evenings, and the particular courage of someone who builds for a storm she hopes will never come. The Earth is still there too, of course. 54 degrees at depth year-round, unchanged since Eleanor pressed her palm against a cold barn floor and felt it for the first time. Unchanged since the Mandan built their earth lodges into the same soil. Unchanged since the first person in some winter, long before any record we have access to, pressed their hand against the ground in the middle of the cold and understood that the cold was a surface condition and that beneath the surface the earth was patient and warm and waiting to be of use. On the low rise at the northeast corner of what was once Eleanor Marsh's property, the grave marker is still there. Niels Marsh, 1844 to 1880. The stone is weathered now, the letters going shallow. In winter, the snow covers it, and in spring, the meltwater runs off it. And in summer, the prairie grass grows around it in the patient, indifferent way. Prairie grass grows around everything that stays in one place long enough. Beneath the grave and beneath the site of the vanished chamber, and beneath the plowed fields, and beneath the roads that cross the land in directions neither Eleanor nor Niels ever anticipated, beneath all of it, at 4 feet of depth, and below the earth maintains its temperature. 54 degrees, steady, unchanged. The best time to build a shelter is before you need one. Eleanor Marsh understood that early enough to act on it at a cost she could barely afford in the face of doubt from people whose experience she respected and whose questions she took seriously and whose lives she saved anyway. She understood it not as a philosophical principle, but as a practical fact grounded in the specific physics of the specific ground beneath her specific barn, proven by the specific arithmetic of 17 people and 43 hours, and the temperature differential between 66 degrees inside and 42 below outside. That is the whole of the story. A woman, a barn, 14 months of evenings, $38, and the stubborn application of careful thought to a problem that everyone around her believed had already been solved. The problem was cold. The solution was earth. The courage required was the courage of doing something you hope you will never need, in the specific faith that preparation is its own kind of answer to the things you cannot predict. The earth is still there, still patient, still warm at depth, still waiting as it has always waited to be useful to anyone willing to listen to what it has been trying to say.